Hello.
I already
Welcome. Welcome to Main Street Books, our virtual meeting space here tonight. So good to see everybody. It's been a long time. Welcome to the 23rd annual Book Clubs of Davidson author event. I did that math a little subjectively because for the first time in a very long time, last year we didn't host the annual Book Clubs of Davidson author event, but we're back. I'm sure that when B.G. Jones and Betty Newbold first conceived of this event 24 years ago, it was unimaginable that we'd be here in this space together like we are. They originally wanted to bring together the very many reading groups, book clubs that met all over Davidson once a year to all read the same book and often meet the author together in an afternoon that was actually called the Book Clubs of Davidson Tea. And there was actually tea and snacks and that sort of thing. And as this gathering has evolved and the folks and the needs of everyone's lives have changed, it's migrated to the evening. And now all of a sudden, it feels like very quickly we've migrated to the internet. Next year, I hope we will be back together, likely even at the Pines again, to have this gathering. But thank you all for being here. We really, really appreciate seeing your faces and knowing that so many people have come together again to read the same book and meet the author. Tonight, we have Kelly Mustian, who is the author of The Girls in the Stilt House. We are all huge fans of this book at the bookstore, but I think that fandom is eclipsed by tonight's conversation partner. I want to introduce you to Maureen Wallace first. Maureen is a lifelong writer, professionally has decades of PR experience under her belt. But I dare say that one of the luckiest events of her life, which perhaps helped her find her own voice, was the birth of her son, Charlie, who has Down syndrome. And she dropped corporate life to stay home with him and then their two other children who followed, and really found her calling. She is an advocate for people with Down syndrome and their families. Her charm, charisma, humor are like no other. And she is the person you want to be your cheerleader. For that reason, we asked her to come and interview Kelly Mustian because I don't know a bigger fan of The Girls in the Stilt House. The Girls in the Stilt House, as I said, is the debut novel of our guest of honor tonight, Kelly Mustian, who is, to our delight, actually a neighbor, so to speak, of the bookstore and has been a great supporter and friend for a long time of Main Street Books. But she's also a nationally best-selling author with this first book, which is really, really remarkable. She grew up in Natchez, Mississippi, at the end of the Natchez Trace, where this book is set. She's written for numerous publications preceding this first novel. She's won a Blumenthal Writers and Readers Series Award. She's a past recipient of a regional artist grant from the North Carolina Arts and Science Council, which is really wonderful. She currently lives nearby with her family, and we couldn't be more delighted to have such a thoughtful, caring writer to create and bring these characters into the world. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Maureen, take it away.
Ada, that was the nicest introduction I think I could ever ask for. You're making me get all choky here, but thank you, because I am truly, if there's going to be a fan club for Kelly and for this book, I want to at least be like the secretary or something if I'm not the president. I just love this book, and it's one of those things, you know, the feeling when someone says, oh my gosh, this is one of the best books I've ever read. Like that's an instant, the people you trust who, read good books, recommend good books. And so this was just a no brainer. I love, in fact, Kelly, I think in the blurb on the front, yeah, the best book I've read in a very long time by another best-selling author. I mean, there are no better compliments to give. So my job tonight is just to cheer you on, Kelly, and to cheer on this book because I love it so much. I have a bajillion questions in case nobody asks one. But I also know that we have so many people joining us, and I hope that you'll take the opportunity to ask a question of such an acclaimed author. I'm just really happy to be here.
Well, thank you so much, Maureen. You have just been so supportive, and Main Street Books as well have just been such cheerleaders for this book, and I am beyond grateful. Love seeing this great big group here. Book clubs are my favorite, by far my favorite events to do. They're the best audience. They're all readers. They have at least are familiar with the book, and it's a joy to be with you guys. I just swallowed. I was telling Ada I was eating a grape right before you came on, and I have kind of a grape skin stuck in my throat. So I'm going to plow on here.
Well, Kelly, I can give all kinds of descriptions about this book because please, like, we don't want this to become its own tragedy. So clear your throat. We need this to not be another novel.
That would be fun. Well, I'll just tell you, they've asked me to tell you a little bit about the book. I don't know if everyone here has looked at the book yet, so I'll tell you just a little bit about it to kind of set the stage for the questions that Maureen will have. Personally, I think of this book as part literary fiction, part historical fiction, part Southern Gothic, and part literary fiction. I set out to write the kind of book that I like to read myself, which would be a story with a strong sense of place, kind of steeped in location, a setting that's almost a character itself, with complex and surprising relationships and lush language, some serious circumstances, but ultimately hopeful and uplifting. So that's what I was striving for with this novel. It's set in Mississippi in the 1920s on the Old Natchez Trace, as Ada said. It's about two young women. They're still teenagers, and their lives become entangled by a murder that puts them both in danger. And there's a history that links these girls that only one of them knows about. Ada grew up in a stilt house on the swamp with a very difficult father. She runs away with a musician from a traveling carnival, and she's gone for a year. But eventually she finds herself alone with nowhere to go but back home to the swamp. And soon something sets her father off. He takes a violent turn, and Ada is saved by a stranger who seems to appear out of nowhere in the middle of the night. The stranger is Matilda. She's the daughter of sharecroppers from the other side of the trace and from across the racial divide. And from there, these two girls set up housekeeping together. They develop a tenuous and complex partnership through some dire circumstances, neither of them feeling entirely certain of the other as the story goes along. So with that, I will turn things back over to Maureen, except to say there is someone here. If you saw me smiling through Maureen's talk, it's because there's someone here who has named himself Guy in the Stilt House. So I just want to give kudos to him.
I just hope that person is going to share some really good questions because I saw him as well. That's fabulous. To actually go out and build a stilt house just for this event, that's pretty cool. Pretty cool. Well, let's just dive in because what was so meaningful for me, and I'm sure others feel the same way, the many, many relationships in this book. The mother-daughter relationships, the father-daughter, just so many different relationships. And so I know a lot of authors will create backstories to create these characters. Tell us a little bit about how you created Ada and Matilda, and then their families, all of these characters that come to mean so much.
Yes, I am kind of a blind writer. I start with very little idea of where I'm going and just kind of make discoveries along the way. I knew that with Ada, I wanted to create a character that was broken down emotionally. That was her circumstances had just stripped her of emotion and just broken her, so that she just kind of got through every day in the ways that she learned as a child that she could manage, that would help her to manage. And I wanted to explore her growth as the book goes on. With Matilda, Ada had no family support. I wanted with Matilda to show someone who was different in that even though she was in dire circumstances societally, she had a strong family background. She had a support system. I wanted to show that contrast between Ada and Matilda in that way, one of many contrasts. And I kind of figure out who the characters are as time goes on. It's the relationships between the characters. They change as you write. You know, you think you're going one way, then you go another way. I just start with this tiny kernel of who these characters are, throw some circumstances at them, and see where they go.
I just think that's so fascinating, because I've heard other authors talk about, oh, and she came from this and so many different background stories to get them to where they are. And it just feels so exhausting. It feels very like it would be very freeing to just sit and write and see how these characters come to life. As they come to life, and now, the book ends, do they continue to speak to you? Do you ever think about where they would be next, or an extension of what you've created?
Well, with this book, I had a contract to write another book afterwards, so I have to leave them and move on, and you become very invested in the next characters. But I know that there's one character, my favorite character in the book is Gertie, and Gertie's wisdom speaks to me all the time, and I know that that's been the case with readers as well. I get a lot of letters from readers about particular passages with Gertie where she showed wisdom and strength, and people related that wisdom to their own circumstances, which has just been amazing to hear. So Gertie is, she kind of lives in the back of my head. Gertie is what I aspire to in life. I would love to be more like Gertie. But the other characters, you have to move on,
Yeah, we could all benefit from a Gertie. That's really cool. We've talked about some of the other characters, and you were very gracious to meet with me so that we could chat and talk about the book, and I could ask all the questions about all the spoilers that we're not going to discuss tonight, knowing that there could be people who haven't read the book, or knowing this is being recorded, someone will stumble along it later, and so we don't want to give any spoilers. But talk to me a little bit too about Stella May. How did that character come about? Because she's kind of my favorite.
Yes. Stella May, again, Stella May was not in my head when I started this book at all. She just kind of grew out of Gertie, the idea that Gertie had taken in a child that you don't really know much about her circumstances, but had taken in this child and loved her so dearly, and couldn't have loved her anymore if she was her own daughter or granddaughter. Stella May just kind of grew, and she was a perfect example of innocence in the midst of all the evil that was going on around. Stella May was the bright light of innocence. She was not planned.
That's so true. And you have such interesting contrasts in this book too. And so what I was most taken by when I met you in real life was, here you have this petite woman who has the biggest smile and the biggest heart, that I learned as we got to know each other a little bit. And then when you read the book, there are some, obviously we talk about murder, we all know that, there are some dark moments. And so what is always interesting to me is that contrast. You're writing happy things, but then you also have to have dialogue that might be things you've never even imagined before, and now you're putting them on paper. Can you talk about the emotional journey?
Sure.
That?
I like talking about that. I grew up in Natchez, as Ada said, in Natchez, Mississippi. I grew up during some very tumultuous years of the civil rights movement. Some early years, Mississippi was often even farther behind than other places in things like civil rights. In things like progress and change being made. Mississippi was sometimes seemed a decade or two behind even the rest of the country that was behind where it should have been. I thought long and hard. This is a little bit of a story, so I'll try to move it ahead. I thought long and hard about taking on Matilda. When I wrote the first iteration of this book, I wrote Matilda from a very wide distance. I kept her very far away, very mysterious until the very last chapter, and that's where you learned about the fire and Matilda's connection to Ada and Virgil. I didn't want to overstep. I didn't want to cause any harm. And let me tell you, growing up as a child in Mississippi in the years that I did, I saw a lot of harm. I did not want to add one sentence to that. So I thought about it. The way it came about that I told Matilda's story was that my agent read this version of the book and he said, "I love it, but the pages light up when Matilda's on them. I want you to get rid of a second storyline that I had. Think about telling Matilda's story." And honestly, I thought about that for a year. I had this wonderful New York agent who loved the book. It took me a year to come to terms with how to do this, if I wanted to do this. I finally decided, and I know this doesn't really touch on your question, but your question kind of pushes a button for me.
I love it.
I finally decided that keeping those characters, Natchez, when I was growing up there, was about 50% Black. It's the demographics now, it's even more predominantly Black. And it came to feel like leaving those characters in the background seemed like a form of exclusion in itself. I often talk about where I came from and how well I knew how steeped in that culture I was, how as a child I was so attuned to all this stuff that was going on around me. And my haven was the library. And when I was very young, I picked up 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northrop. I found that when I was very young. That led me to so many slave narratives and early civil rights books like the amazing Coming of Age in Mississippi by Anne Moody. I recommend that to everyone. Which really gives a strong picture of what things were like a little bit before my time in Natchez, in that area. That is an amazing book. So all that to say, all of this contrast. I also read a lot of Southern Gothic authors like Carson McCullers and Robert Penn Warren, people like that. A lot of Southern Gothic books from that period would kind of do a twist, a societal twist on norms and things that were going on at that time in order to make a comment about, a philosophical comment about what was going on. And I kind of did that flip with Ada and Matilda. I gave Ada the power in that relationship. I gave her the... she was not just a strong character, but she had the power in that relationship, which was kind of a flip on society in order to make certain points that I hope people got. So I have just wandered really far away from your question, but I'll stop now.
I love that so much. Just that background and really it's like due diligence, it's taking a dive into the research to make sure that the story that you're depicting can be as full as possible, but knowing that obviously there are always going to be limitations to what you can, to your voice.
It's also, to me, it was bearing witness to what I knew to be true. And that was important to me as I was writing.
I love that. Okay, well, that was deep and that was awesome. And now I'm gonna throw a zinger at you that's completely opposite. It is so fascinating to me when I read these books, the descriptive prose about the environment. And I think, my gosh, how are these authors experts in, I think I put one like button bush and, all these different plants. And tell me how you create these scenes. Do you, that's the question.
Well, I grew up there. It was where I came of age. It's the place that I'm from. So I knew the landscape very well. There's a line in the book somewhere, and I can't quote it exactly, but a line that said that Ada had made friends with the landscape. And I think that a lot of kids who come from maybe not from homes with some difficulties. I came from a home that had some difficulties going on, and I made friends with the landscape. So I knew those trees that I wrote about in the book. I knew the flowers. I knew the button bush. It's just a place that I knew well. And being sort of a literary fiction writer, I'm very tied into landscape in my writing. I use it as analogies. There are several analogies in the book that are based on flora and the plants and trees and things. Trees is a very big theme in this book. I actually originally called this book A Jury of Trees, and I got kind of, I held on to that for a long time, but the marketing department knew better, so they came up with this great title. But there's a strong theme of nature in the book.
And that's actually one of the ones that I pulled out, with a jury of trees assembled behind her. The landscape was such a powerful setting for for all of these scenes. And I love knowing that you just knew it. I honestly, I grew up around some trees and there was a rock, but kudos to you for actually having the information. I would have to research so much. I want to turn back a little bit to the dark side, because there are such specific villains in this story. And I would love to hear you talk about how the emotional journey of creating that villain and writing that dialogue, and then being able to switch back and forth from the dark to Ada's innocence, things like that.
There is a passage in the book. It's the point where Virgil returns. Ada's been waiting for him in the stilt house, and he returns, and he's not a nice guy. And her response to some of his horribleness is to look at him and say he was a child once, and to imagine him as a toddler walking around on little toddler bare feet and falling over and toddler smiles. That was one of the ways she dealt with what she was having to endure. And I think that with a villain like Virgil, I think the kernel of truth in that for me that I started with and built on and expanded was that sometimes the worst villains are essentially extremely insecure people. And you can see that with Virgil. He never felt as good as the Crawdads. He was always trying to look like a big man and always pitifully failing. And a lot of times those kinds of people are the hardest on their family, because that is a place where they can have control. And you saw that with Teensy, and you saw that, not with Teensy, you saw that with Ada's mother, and with Ada herself. And so I decided I wanted to kind of expand on that idea with Virgil and show what a weak coward he really was, and yet a terrorist in a lot of ways to his family. As far as Frank came along as I was writing. He's just your typical standard violent bully.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of
run of the mill jerk. A question that I always have when I'm reading such wonderful writing that moves me to tears is whether the author was brought to tears as well while you were writing this. Were there moments where you had to take a step back and take a deep breath?
There was. This is going to be a disappointing answer, but I will talk too about the letters that I've gotten. There is one place in the book that made me cry every time. I probably read this book literally 100 times, and every time I came to that place, I would have tears rolling down my face. And where I'm going to disappoint you is, I don't remember what it was. I could guess what it was, but it was something that just hit me personally. And it may not have been the scene that I would expect it to be. Thinking about it now, there's a scene that I think it might have been, but I literally do not remember because I've been working on so many other projects in between. I can say that the scene that I get the most letters about, that are really just so gratifying, are about the scene in the book where Gertie is comforting Matilda, It's toward the end, and the big climax of the book has happened, and the devastation in Matilda's life has happened, and Gertie comforts her and lifts her up, and or tries to. People have written me such surprising letters about how those words from Gertie have helped them and had meaning for them in completely different circumstances, in their lives, particularly about getting over grief. Kind of chokes me up talking about it. I get letters from people who have lost a loved one who said that Gertie's words to Matilda helped them through. So rather than what makes me cry, I think that's the bigger answer there.
Absolutely. Has there been any really surprising response to the characters? Is there one that you just really didn't expect it to make such an impact, or have it had that sort of impact on someone?
I'm always surprised by people who are so moved by passages in the book. It's always, not that I didn't hope the book was moving, but I can tell you one really tender moment for me was before the book was published. My editor sent it to a sensitivity reader who just to read it at the, before it went out, just to see if she had any comments. It was I was a little bit nervous because I wanted someone who was from the South, from that area, from the deep South, someone who understood the history of that place. I didn't want someone who would give it a quick pass. I wanted someone who would be tough and hard to sell, because this really did mean a lot to me, to cause no harm. And some of the things that sensitivity reader said to me were extremely moving, and I'm not going to say what they are, because we're being recorded, and I don't want to encroach on her privacy, but that some of those comments were surprising to me, and just meant the whole world to me. So,
Absolutely. It's got to feel like a validation, even though you experienced what you experienced and you saw what you saw, having that. And for those of you who might not know what a sensitivity reader is, do you have a good description of that for us, Kelly?
Yes, and I don't want to say it was just validation, because it was so much more than that. The conversation was so much more than that, and I know I'm being kind of vague here, but I wasn't looking for validation. I was looking for honesty, and I got that, and I really appreciated that. And what did you ask me? I'm sorry again.
No, that's a huge distinction. What a sensitivity reader is.
Oh, sensitivity reader. I don't know a lot about that myself. In my case, because I dealt with such heavy racial issues, I don't want to be the spokesperson for what a sensitivity reader is, but in my case, just making sure there aren't any blind spots. I'm a white person. I was very aware, and this is why it took me a year to decide whether to write this character. I'm very aware that we all have blind spots. It was a joy to me to have a sensitivity reader, just to feel satisfied that the book that went out wasn't causing harm or doing an injustice to anyone. And I'm still listening about that. I am so open to talking about that, and to any comment from anybody, any question anybody has. There are Black people in my family, Black children in my family. I really care about this issue. But I'm sure that there are different types of sensitivity readers who come at it from different positions. So it's hard to just say this is what a sensitivity reader does. But my sensitivity reader was wonderful. She was frank. She was right out there, and she made me cry for sure.
Oh.
For many reasons, not validation.
Well, I am seeing some awesome questions come in. Colleen Kopchik asks, Kelly, was there an Anna? Is it Annis or Annis? How do you pronounce it?
Annis.
Annis. Yeah, right. And I just realized, we all have our own in our head, and then what you were actually thinking might not match. She says, where did that name come from? Did you have an Annis in your family? I have a relative who lived in the mid 1800s named Annis, and have never seen that name anywhere else. Oh, cool.
Again, this might be a little disappointing, but this is how this happened. I don't know an Annis, and I have heard from a couple of readers who had an Annis, a grandmother named Annis. I love that name. If I'm stuck for a name and I know the kind of sound I want, I know what I want to portray in a name, sometimes I'll take a common name, take the front letter off of it. And that's what I did with Annis. I thought Janice, took off the front letter, it became Annis, and I loved it.
Oh, wow.
So
That is
nothing
so,
romantic there.
no, I love that though. It's a process. It's the way that you made it unique to yourself, to this book. That's
So
awesome.
can I just jump in and tell you, I looked up Annis after I typed in the question, and it's from Greek origin, and it means pure and virginal.
Oh my goodness, I didn't even know that. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's
Thank you
awesome.
very much.
That's awesome. Marty Baker, I know you. She asks, who was the hardest character to flesh out and bring to life? That's a great question.
Yeah, well, the hardest characters for me were Matilda and Gertie, because I just was, I had so much in my head. I had so much thinking going on as I was writing those characters. I wanted so much to get them right. They were the most difficult. With language, I definitely understood the language of that area. Not in the 20s, but not so many decades later. I was very careful to be very light on any kind of dialect or Southern accent. I wanted readers to be able to bring to the words their own interpretation of what it would sound like. I decided that with Ada's Southern accent and with Matilda's dialect, as far as dialect with both of them, I wanted to just give a little hint, a little country hint. I used words that both white people and black people would have used back then. I gave each of the characters a few key words that they used repeatedly, but I wanted the reader to bring that authenticity to it, rather than standing in the way of that. So that was one of the difficulties with the characters, and deciding just how to do that. But yeah, because I was so concerned, Ada and Gertie and Dalton, that whole bringing that story forward, all of those characters.
It was such a strong, beautiful family. We have a question from Heather following up on Colleen's. So I think we answered a little bit about how you pick or how you name your characters, but then she also asked, do you pick their name first, or do you let them evolve and kind of pick their own names? I wonder if it's differs by
I've changed
character.
their names so many times that I can't keep it straight. Even on the new thing that I'm working on now, I've changed the characters' names so many times. I do a search and replace, and I can never remember. I have to keep a list of what the current name of all the characters is, just so I can go back, especially with alternating time periods and alternating storylines. I will have changed someone's name so far back in the other storyline. I just keep a list. This is what everybody's current name is. Sometimes I write the whole book and then change someone's name at the last second.
Do you ever sketch out org charts of like family trees, things like that, to keep it all straight?
No, I don't take the time to do that. I make lists, and I have a notebook with things written in it. I have lots of computer files, but the time it would take me to do a family tree or that kind of thing, I just no, especially under a deadline.
All these images in my head, and I love hearing how it actually plays out. One of the questions I definitely wanted to ask, though, for you to talk about the mother-daughter relationships, because they were in such contrast, but then also had some similarities, some true love there.
Right. We didn't get to see much about Ada's mother because she died before the story started. You see a little bit about her when Ada is on the porch thinking about her mother and looking at the cypress trees and remembering what her mother told her about the trees. She was, in my mind, almost a grown-up version of Ada, kind of a victim of Virgil. But with Matilda, I wanted her to have a strong family unit. What's not explored too much, the only thing in the book that's not fictional, is the reference to the Carrollton County Courthouse Massacre. That was a real thing that happened. And in explaining the relationship between Matilda and her mother, I mention in the book that her mother was an orphan. Teensy was an orphan because her parents were killed in the courthouse massacre in Carrollton. And I don't go into much about that, but understanding that her mother's timidity, because she knew what happened to her parents and she had had that over her head her whole life. And so she was timid about stepping out of line in where she was, what would have been considered her stepping out of line, whereas Matilda was a teenager. So I kind of did a contrast between Matilda and Teensy. They had such a strong mother-daughter bond, but Matilda was a brash teenager, as brash as she could be. She was smart enough to not get herself killed, although sometimes that often didn't stop people from getting killed. But that I wanted to show an ordinary contrast between a mother and a teenage daughter in the midst of these not normal, not ordinary, not conceivable circumstances that they were in. They still had that dynamic.
I love that. I really love that. Susan Ross says, I found the book to be very well crafted. The incident with Buddy and Cassie Jones that Matilda witnessed, I'm trying to make sure I'm not giving any spoilers, was heartbreaking, but so important to include. How did you happen to include that particular story?
Well, again, I knew the setting. I knew a lot about. I grew up. I was very, very young when Martin Luther King was leading protests there. I was a very little girl, but I was there, and I understood the kind of thing that was going on right in front of my eyes when I lived there. And like I said, I started reading civil rights books and slave narratives when I was very young, and I continued that all through my life. So I had an understanding of the kind of things that happened, but I can't say that research for this book, just to make sure I had every detail right, was really brutal. It was tough. And the kinds of things, I've said this before in events, if I had really portrayed the kind of everyday things that happened in that time period, it would have been too much. It would have overwhelmed the story completely. I wanted to tell this simple story about these two young women. As dark and as harsh as it seems, it really was just a small little snippet of the big picture that was going on. And the scene with Buddy Jones and his wife on the sidewalk, and the idea of their having been told to step off the sidewalk, that happened all the time. And I did verify everything that I portrayed like that with research. That was not fun to do at all. But yeah, so it was a combination of research and understanding the mindset of the period and the place.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that research and just how, because I can't imagine the immense pressure you must put on yourself as an author to get it right, to get those facts right.
Yeah, I did a lot of research, and really this is what I generally do when I'm writing. This was the first book that was published. It was not the first book I've written. It wasn't the first book that went out on submission. But what I have learned to do, because I am so meticulous about research, is to write it the way I think it was, to write it the way I hope it was when I'm writing scenes, because you so often cut out whole chapters, you cut out whole threads, whole plot twists, and if you spend a whole lot of time doing that meticulous research on each scene, you lose a lot of time because you end up cutting it and it was all wasted. So I'll often write things the way I believe they were, and then at the end start the research at the end of the first draft.
I was on mute. Whoever does that. It's only been 2 years. Natasha asks a question that I think is okay to, and it's there so everyone can read it if it's a spoiler. There you go. Poof. Thanks, Natasha. We were doing so well. I think it's something that happens early enough in the book that it's okay to talk about, but no, you're fine. I'm teasing.
Go ahead.
Natasha. It says our book club read this book and debated whether Matilda went to Ada's with the intention to kill Virgil. Was it clear to you as the author whether that was her plan or just a coincidence?
It was clear to me. I don't know how clear it was to to the people reading the book, and again, a lot of readers come up with different ideas. To me, and I did touch on this in the book, to me, Matilda never would have killed anyone. And it kind of ticked her off in a way at one point in the book that she did this favor for Ada. I don't know what that sound is, but she did this, that in trying, with all of her vengeful thoughts and all of her brash thoughts about, how she might, what she might do, she knew she never would have just killed someone. She knew she never would have done that. But in order to save Ada's life, she ended up doing what she had dreamed in her head of doing and comforted herself that she might do. She did it to save Ada, to save someone's life, and it was to save the villain's life. So the daughter of the villain's life. So there was less satisfaction in that for her, although it does show that what a good person she was, what a noble person she was.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Denise Howard, I think this might be the Denise Howard I know. I love seeing questions from people I know. Says this was just a lovely piece of writing. You mentioned having a year to make a decision about an element of the book. Now that you're such a successful published author, are you feeling greater pressure to finish your next book? And are you willing to give us a general idea about the topic? Oh, thank you for asking this, Denise.
Well,
I know
because
you
you're a book
can't
club,
answer.
I'm going to forget that this is being recorded online and say I am under big pressure in my own mind with this book, with the next book, under pressure to make it as good as the first one was. To me, to feel like it's on the same level as Stilt House was, when I had several years to work on Stilt House, and I don't have anywhere near that amount of time with the second one. So don't want to let any of you guys down with the second book. So yeah, I'm feeling some pressure there. Working really hard to, it's also kind of a long book, so there's that too. But yeah, I'm putting a lot of pressure on myself here. Nobody else is pressuring me, but we do that to ourselves.
We do, and it's so often unwarranted. And so I always say it's so amazing to me how every book, it's just an arrangement of words, really. So, it's just how every author manages to arrange them. But the way that you've arranged the words in this book, it's just so beautiful and eloquent. It made me cry. It made me laugh. It made me snicker, all of those things, which actually leads to one of the questions I wanted to ask you. Are there any books out there that come to mind for you immediately when you think of a book that made you cry, a book that made you feel so much emotion?
Oh, so many books have made me cry. I wasn't avoiding your question about what I'm working on next, and I will tell you what that is if you want to hear that first.
Yes.
I'm working on something set in the 1930s. It's set in the 1930s in Mississippi and in the early 70s in North Carolina. It's basically about two sisters who discovered when they were kids that they weren't biologically related. They found something that showed that they had a different mother. And now that they're adults, one of the sisters, the older sister, decides to dig into that past history of her younger sister without her sister's knowledge or consent. And chaos ensues as she's trying to figure out what happened in the 30s, where her sister came from, that kind of thing.
Oh, wow. That is so fascinating. And I can't imagine going back and forth in those time periods. Are you writing like the 1930s part completely and then going to the 1970s, or do you go back and forth with the story?
I go back and forth because very similar to Stilt House, there are little pieces that kind of fit in together as you read the book. There'll be something from a chapter way back that has meaning for something several chapters later. Little pieces that you're putting together. I like to kind of touch back on something and hope the reader will have a nice moment. Oh yeah, I remember that, and that's why that was there. I like doing that. So I can't do all of the 30s and then all of the 70s because I would miss that little interweaving of details. But when I get stuck in one storyline, I'll just give it up and go back to the other storyline, and it's a nice break to be able to move among the two. Actually, there are 3 points of view, so it's fun for me to do it that way. It's more fun than just a linear book would be.
And I, as a reader, I love those threads when those moments where they come together and you realize, oh, this part now connects to that part of the story and characters interweave. It's just, I love that moment in a book. Okay, breaking news. We have a question from the guy in the stilt house.
Oh.
I hope he's not named Virgil. No offense if your name is Virgil. What sort of writing routine do you follow when you are working on a book? I always love hearing these answers.
Yes. Well, I can say my routine now is different because since the publication of Stilt House, I've had a lot of promotional things to do, a lot of book club events, all fun. I enjoy them so much and I'm so grateful for each one of them. But I can't have my normal routine because you never know what the next day is going to bring. I have a very unpredictable schedule with that kind of thing. So I write when there's time. I write like I did when my child was very young, whenever there's a moment, I used to tell myself with the first book I wrote, if I have 30 minutes, I'm going to spend it writing. That's what I'm going to do. And you just look for that time. I like on the best day, the perfect day would be to have 3 writing sessions, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, one in the evening. I do kind of keep rock star hours. I'm much too old for that, but I work till 2 or 3 in the morning often. Sometimes it's 4 o'clock before I'm actually asleep, and then I have to kind of sleep in a little bit the next morning. So I do write in the still of the night when everybody's asleep and it's just me, and I'm up when people aren't supposed to be up, and it just works for me. It doesn't work the next morning though.
Yeah, but you can quit your day job because this is phenomenal. You're an amazing writer. So that's the most important thing. And it's very interesting to know that the guy in the stilt house, his name is actually Virgil. Very good. It just all lines up. Susan says, we see the violin behind you. Does music play a role in your writing?
It does. I don't play the violin. That's my son's violin. He's a wonderful violinist. But yes, music does play a role. I keep a playlist for each thing that I'm writing. I have a playlist for my new one. And you can go on my social media on Instagram or Twitter and find the playlist that I had for Stilt House. I always have songs that relate in my head to what's going on in the book. Music is very inspiring to me. I can't listen while I write. I have to have silence while I write, but I have lots of playlists on an old school iPod, and I have an old school docking station, and I keep that in the kitchen. So when I'm cooking, I don't like using earbuds or headphones. I like the room to be full of music. So I keep that old docking station in there, and I listen to music while I'm writing, while I'm cooking, or while I'm washing dishes or whatever I'm doing in the kitchen. And I often have to run back to my writing room and scratch out some notes that I had because of a song I was listening to. Songs are extremely inspiring to me.
I love that. Well, we're getting toward the end of our time. So if anyone else has questions, please pop them up there. Although it's hard to beat the guy in the stilt house. I believe in all of you for attending tonight. And I know that we can come up with some additional questions. Let's see.
Maureen, well, I was going to jump in and say there is one from earlier asking, is there a character who isn't leaving you alone, perhaps demanding another book?
I love that question.
I was thinking, is there any character from Stilt House that is influencing your second book, even if they're not, like you're not writing the connection?
Right. Well, let me answer that second part first. There are themes, there are characters, or at least traits of characters that I'm also using in the next book. I'm working really hard to not allow myself to have too much of that, but some of the same themes that I dealt with, like loss. The concept of loss is very strong in the second book, although it's completely different. When you think about 2 sisters and one doesn't know where she came from, there's some loss involved there, different kind of loss, but but there are more themes that stay with me than particular characters. And I don't think Stilt House would work. I don't think a sequel would work. I do get a whole lot of letters from people that want a sequel, and that's just really, really complimentary. I so appreciate that people are so invested in these characters that they want to know where they go. And I sometimes tell book clubs I did have alternate endings for this book. I wrote several different kinds of endings. And there was an epilogue at one point that showed just what happened to Ada and what happened to Matilda. There was one version where Annis grew up and had heard about Matilda. All of her life knew about Matilda, and she wrote Matilda a letter, and that tied up everything with what was happening with all the characters in their current lives. I know what happened to Ada and Matilda, but I liked leaving it open-ended. I didn't want to, with all the difficult concepts in this book, I didn't want to tie it up with a nice neat bow and everybody lived happily ever after. And well, they did, or they were able to live happily ever after in a sense, but I didn't want it to be just too easy and too pat and too simple. I wanted to leave it kind of open-ended.
That was one of the things that I loved best about the book, the way that it ended. It wasn't a predictable, comfortable necessarily ending. But now I'm interested to know how much I should write on the check so that you're going to let me read that epilogue and all of those things that didn't get published, because now I want to know.
I don't know if I kept that epilogue, but I will at least tell you what happened.
Let's see. Oh, Annette, thank you for coming in at the under the wire here. She says, I really enjoyed reading your book. A lot of plot and great character depth without a lot of fluff, as you mentioned. Did you cut from your first draft, and how did you decide how long your book is in the end? Oh, how much did you cut from your first draft, and how do you decide the length?
I like to write really long. I like to write much more than I know I can use. This book is kind of long for a novel. It's 94,000 words. I was shooting for 90, but I wrote about 120,000 words. And the reason I like to do that is because it forces you to cut out every single thing that doesn't have to be there. And it's kind of like refining a diamond, you just cut away so much because you have to, and I had to do it very quickly in the case of Stilt House, so I had to be ruthless and just chop, chop, chop. And that works so well for a writer, at least for me, to have to get rid of things that you're attached to. Some people get attached to storylines, and I get attached to sentences. I get attached to the beauty of language itself. And if I've drawn an analogy, or I've done something that I think is just a clever play on words, that kind of thing, that really doesn't need to be there and is only there because I thought it was pretty or profound in some way, that all needs to go. And writing much too long forces me to have to. I don't have to kill my darlings, but I have to kill my darling sentences.
I was just going to say Stephen King's, kill your darlings.
Yeah.
Was there a darling that you had to kill in this book?
I killed so many people, didn't I? I mean, I heard with the first two books, this was the third book that I wrote. With the first two books, I heard things from editors like, beautiful writing, but too quiet to make a literary splash. That's what one of them said. And I got a lot of comments like that. So I worked really hard to make this one louder, to have a lot. I kept my love of literary fiction and the pretty language, or what I thought was pretty language and meaningful language, but I threw in a whole lot of action. And then I would find that because of where I wanted to go with the plot, this person just had to go. So I did end up killing darlings too, but it didn't bother me. There were a couple of deaths. There were some deaths that disturbed me greatly. But having to kill off people like, well, I don't want to say, but
yeah. No, I'm going to keep you from the spoilers.
On the farm, there were, of course, deaths that were devastating to me. That was hard. It was a hard book to write.
Absolutely. I mean, that's, for me, that's the when you get to a point in a book and you lose a character that you've grown to love so much, particularly if it's a violent death or just any sort of not natural causes, that really moves me. what other authors motivate you? Do you ever, as you're writing or feel a moment of being stuck in that famous writer's block, is there someone you pick up to get you going again, to get your wheels turning again?
I do read a lot while I'm writing. I find it very inspiring. I have these rules for what I can read while I'm writing. It has to be something in the same general arena, literary fiction, if I'm writing literary fiction. If I'm writing a historical setting, then I like to read a historical setting, but it can't be the same one that I'm writing. So it has to be in the same universe, but not too close. I can't read anything that is too close. I really wanted to read the Nickel Boys when I was working on Stilt House. And even though that's a different setting, a different time period, I just was too much in a similar arena. I just couldn't read it. So the first thing I did when I finished this book was to read the Nickel Boys. But yeah, I find beautiful writing wildly inspiring. I often will decide I'm just going to sit down and read a couple of chapters of some wonderful book, and I read the first 2 paragraphs, and it's already made me think about something, and I solve a problem in my book, and I go work on it after a couple of paragraphs.
I love that. I love that. And then Annette also asked, when can we look forward to reading your next book?
Oh, I do get that question a lot, and I just I don't know. I don't know. You know, there's a process from the time the book is finished until it goes out. That takes a certain amount of time, and I just don't know how much revision will have to happen. So I can't really make an estimate there, but not
Well,
too long.
that's a teaser for us to follow you all on your social media channels and keep up.
Yes, that would be great. I am really bad at social media, so yeah, come follow me. Have pity.
Ada, what you got? You got any more questions? You're on mute. Yay, I wasn't the only one.
I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I think we addressed everyone's. So I think we're all covered with questions.
We've tied it up in a bow.
We have, unlike the book itself.
Unlike the book, yes, full circle. There we have it, people.
Well, that gives me a chance to say one quick thing besides thank you all for coming. It's difficult for a writer who's an introvert to get used to being, full screen in the spotlight, answering questions, and I thank you for your patience, and I so appreciate everyone being here. But I also do want to say, if you don't have the book, and if you plan to buy it, this has been such a hard time for independent bookstores everywhere. Main Street Books has been so good to me. I stumble on things that they've said about my book that they've never even told me is out there. I've stumbled on a couple of those things where Main Street has promoted my book. So if you haven't bought it and you want to buy it, please buy it from Main Street Books. If you're here tonight, or even anybody who's watching, I know there's a discount going on right now for today, and give them some love. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We love sharing your book with the world. It is our tradition to have a 10% discount on the book clubs of Davidson selected title, and so we're just going to honor that through the rest of the night. If you're at the computer still and you want to find it on our website and order it, that discount will show up.
And Ada, I have to say, your website and being able to search, find, order, immediately go and pick up, it's just so easy and it's been so awesome. Don't tell my husband.
Thank you. That was a big pivot for us last winter, and
I order a lot and have the books sent to me, even though I don't live far away, just because I'm busy and I can't get there and I want the book now, or I want to pre-order it while I'm remembering it. So
yeah, we do lots of pre-ordering.
Yeah.
Happy to ship.
My trick is that I of course can come in and pick it up, and then also walk around and buy a couple more books too. Thank you so much for letting me do this. As an avid reader, that was just a dream come true. Kelly, you're amazing, and I just had so much fun getting to know you. And Ada, you and Main Street Books just keep on being amazing.
Thanks, and keep coming to the store, because I will say one of the fun things is having folks like Maureen come and give us book recommendations. Takes a village.
Has that ever happened? I don't know.
Of course it
Ask
has.
Emily.
Takes a village. Thanks everyone so much for being here.
Thank you, Maureen.
Another year, another Book Clubs of Davidson gathering. Take care, everyone.
Great job. Have a good night.